A single dad adopted a homeless girl. 15 years later, she saved his empire in court. How could one decision connect two lives across 15 years? What kind of journey could lead from adoption to a courtroom where everything hangs in the balance? Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're here for another unforgettable story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest inspiring stories. Your support means the world to us, and we're truly grateful to have you with us on this journey. Now we'd love to hear from you. What do you think is the greatest gift a single act of kindness can create over time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And with that, let's step into a story where one life-changing choice begins an extraordinary journey. If the truth ever walks into this courtroom, someone powerful is going to lose everything. The words hung in the air so quietly that almost no one noticed them, yet they settled over the courtroom like a coming storm. Ethan Brooks sat alone at the defense table, his hands folded, his shoulders straight, and his expression calm despite the cameras waiting for the moment his world would collapse. Reporters whispered his name as though the verdict had already been written. Across the room, Richard Holloway smiled with the confidence of a man who believed money could erase history. His attorneys shuffled thick binders onto the polished table while investors watched from the gallery, wondering how a respected founder had become the face of a public scandal. Ethan never looked at them. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the American flag standing beside the judge's bench, and for the briefest moment, an old memory crossed his face before disappearing again. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered, and everyone rose. "Court is now in session," she said firmly. The room fell silent except for the faint scratching of a reporter's pen. Richard leaned toward his lead attorney with a quiet grin. "He won't make it through today." Ethan heard the words, but he didn't react. He had spent too many years building a company with patience, honesty, and long nights to let one cruel sentence shake him now. Still, silence had a weight of its own. Every headline outside painted him as the villain. Every television screen suggested his empire had been built on deception. Yet no witness had spoken. No decisive evidence had been presented. Something about the story felt unfinished, even to the people who wanted him to fail. Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses. "Counsel, you may proceed." Richard's attorney stood with polished confidence and began describing a case that sounded devastating. Each sentence carefully crafted to convince the courtroom that Ethan's success had come at someone else's expense. The gallery listened closely. Some nodded. Others frowned. Ethan remained perfectly still, refusing to interrupt even when accusations filled the room. His restraint confused more than one observer. Why wasn't he defending himself? Why did he look less like a defeated businessman and more like someone waiting for the right moment? In the back row, a young woman quietly stepped through the courtroom doors carrying a leather briefcase. She paused for only a second before taking a seat where few people noticed her. She watched Ethan with eyes that held recognition instead of doubt. Ethan never turned around, unaware that someone from a forgotten chapter of his life had just arrived. As the attorney declared that the truth would finally destroy Ethan Brooks forever, the young woman slowly opened her briefcase, revealing a worn photograph tucked beside a stack of legal documents, and a quiet determination settled across her face that no one in the courtroom could yet understand. The young woman closed the briefcase without making a sound, but the worn photograph remained in her thoughts like a promise that had waited years to be fulfilled. Across the courtroom, Ethan Brooks continued listening as one accusation followed another. Every sentence seemed designed to erase decades of honest work, yet he refused to interrupt. His attorney leaned closer and whispered, "We can challenge that statement right now." Ethan slowly shook his head. Not yet. There was no fear in his voice, only patience that had been tested many times before. Judge Eleanor Hayes watched the exchange with careful attention. She had presided over enough difficult cases to recognize the difference between panic and quiet confidence. Richard Holloway noticed Ethan's composure and frowned for the first time that morning. He had expected frustration, maybe even anger, but not silence. "He knows he cannot win," Richard murmured to Victor Langford. Victor nodded politely, although something about the case continued to bother him. Several key details were missing, and Ethan's reactions did not match the picture that had been painted. Meanwhile, the young woman looked toward the witness stand before lowering her eyes to the photograph again. It showed a much younger Ethan standing beside a frightened little girl wrapped in an oversized winter coat. The edges of the picture had faded, but one thing remained perfectly clear. Ethan was smiling with the quiet warmth of someone who expected nothing in return. She gently slid the photograph back into the folder and placed one hand over it, as though protecting something priceless. The courtroom clerk called for the next exhibit, and another stack of documents appeared on a large screen. Charts, financial reports, and business records filled the room. Reporters typed quickly, believing they were watching the final chapter of a famous entrepreneur. Yet Ethan seemed more interested in the people around him than in the accusations themselves. He noticed a nervous young clerk struggling to organize paperwork after dropping several folders onto the floor. Without hesitation, Ethan stepped forward, gathered the scattered pages, and handed them back with a quiet smile before returning to his seat. "Thank you," the embarrassed clerk whispered. Ethan simply nodded. The small act lasted only a few seconds, but the young woman in the gallery noticed every detail. So did Judge Hayes. Richard looked away impatiently, dismissing the moment as meaningless. He did not understand that character often revealed itself through the smallest choices. Outside the courthouse, television crews continued broadcasting predictions about Ethan's downfall, while inside, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute. Victor rose from his chair and requested permission to introduce another witness. Before Judge Hayes could respond, the young woman finally stood. Calm, confident, and carrying nothing except her leather briefcase, she took one measured step into the center aisle. Every head in the courtroom turned toward her as she spoke for the first time. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "before this case goes any further, there is something this court deserves to know." The courtroom became so quiet that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Judge Eleanor Hayes looked toward the young woman standing in the aisle. "Please identify yourself for the record," she said calmly. The woman nodded with quiet confidence. "My name is Grace Carter. I am an attorney licensed in this state, and I respectfully request permission to address the court regarding evidence that directly affects this case." Richard Holloway exchanged an irritated glance with Victor Langford. Neither of them had expected an interruption from someone whose name had never appeared on the witness list. Victor stood immediately. "Your Honor, we object. This is highly unusual." Judge Hayes rested her hands on the bench. "Miss Carter, this court will hear your reason before ruling." Grace took a slow breath before opening her briefcase. She removed the faded photograph with extraordinary care, as though it carried a lifetime rather than a single memory. Ethan finally turned toward her. The instant he saw the picture, something changed in his expression. It was not fear. It was recognition mixed with disbelief. He stared at the photograph, then at Grace, searching her face for an answer his heart seemed to know before his mind could accept it. Grace smiled softly, but her eyes glistened. 15 years ago, she began, one decision changed my entire life." Richard leaned back in his chair with visible impatience. "What does this have to do with corporate records?" he asked sharply. Grace did not look at him. "Everything," she replied. "Because character is not built inside a courtroom. It is revealed long before anyone is watching." Several people in the gallery shifted forward in their seats. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. Judge Hayes studied the photograph before returning it to Grace. "Continue." Grace nodded. "Many years ago, I was a homeless child with nowhere to go and no reason to believe anyone would ever stop for me." Ethan lowered his eyes, remembering a freezing evening outside a neighborhood shelter, a frightened little girl sitting alone on a weathered bench, and the quiet promise he had made to himself before walking toward her. He had never thought of that moment as extraordinary. He had simply seen a child who needed kindness. Grace looked at Ethan again. "He never asked who I could become. He only cared about who I was that day." Richard folded his arms. "This is an emotional performance, not legal evidence." Grace calmly reached back into her briefcase and removed a neatly organized folder bearing official court seals, adoption records, and certified documents. She placed them on the evidence table without raising her voice. "These records establish my legal relationship with Mr. Brooks, and they also establish why I possess evidence that no one else in this courtroom has ever seen." Ethan's attorney slowly looked through the first page, then toward Ethan with astonishment. Ethan remained silent, overwhelmed by memories he had carried quietly for years. Judge Hayes accepted the documents from the clerk and began reading them carefully. As the judge reached the final page, her expression became noticeably more serious. She looked directly at Grace and asked one question that instantly changed the direction of the entire trial. "Miss Carter, are you telling this court that you have evidence capable of proving how this case truly began?" Grace met Judge Eleanor Hayes's eyes without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor," she answered. "And I can prove that the foundation of this case rests on a story that was never told." The courtroom remained perfectly still. Judge Hayes nodded once. "You may proceed." Grace walked to the evidence table and carefully arranged several folders beside the faded photograph. "Before I became an attorney, before I graduated from law school, before anyone knew my name, I was simply a frightened child trying to survive one more winter." She paused, allowing the silence to settle. "Mr. Brooks never treated me as someone to be rescued. He treated me as someone worth believing in." Richard Holloway rose immediately. "Objection. Personal history is not evidence." Judge Hayes looked toward him. "If counsel believes this testimony lacks relevance, that concern can be addressed after the foundation is established. Sit down." Richard reluctantly returned to his seat, clearly frustrated. Grace opened the first folder. "These are certified adoption records. These are financial statements from the same period. These are personal journals written by Mr. Brooks during the years when his company barely survived." Ethan looked surprised. "You kept those?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled. "You once told me that every honest beginning matters, even if nobody else sees it." Ethan lowered his eyes, remembering evenings at a small kitchen table where unpaid bills covered every inch of the surface while a little girl colored pictures beside him without complaining. There had been nights when dinner was simple soup and bread, yet Grace had always believed they were the richest family in the neighborhood because laughter never disappeared from their home. She remembered asking him once, "Are we going to be all right?" Ethan had smiled even though exhaustion showed in his face. "We already are," he had answered. "Money changes comfort. It does not decide who we become." Those words had stayed with her through every challenge that followed. Grace placed another document before the judge. "While raising me alone, Mr. Brooks invested every available dollar into building his company. He rejected shortcuts that would have brought quick profits because he believed integrity was worth more than immediate success." Victor Langford carefully examined the records from across the room. The dates matched. The signatures matched. The financial timeline matched. None of it resembled the story that had been presented earlier. Richard noticed Victor's expression and quietly whispered, "Stay focused." But Victor no longer looked certain. Grace continued. "Years later, after I entered law school, I began reviewing corporate compliance because I wanted to understand the values that built this company. That research led me somewhere unexpected." She removed a sealed envelope bearing an official certification stamp and placed it gently on the evidence table. Inside this envelope are records that explain how these accusations truly began. Every person in the courtroom watched as Judge Hayes reached for the sealed evidence. Even Richard's confident smile disappeared for the first time that day, because he suddenly realized there were chapters of this story that he had never expected anyone to uncover. Judge Eleanor Hayes carefully broke the official seal and removed the documents one page at a time. The silence inside the courtroom grew heavier with every second. Grace Carter waited patiently, her hands resting on the edge of the table, while Ethan Brooks watched without saying a word. Richard Holloway shifted in his chair for the first time that morning. Confidence had slowly given way to uncertainty. Judge Hayes studied the first document, then another, before raising her eyes toward Grace. "Please explain how you obtained these records." Grace nodded respectfully. "During my final year of law school, I accepted an internship with a corporate compliance firm that specialized in internal governance. While reviewing historical filings connected to several major acquisitions, I noticed repeated inconsistencies involving shell companies that appeared only briefly before disappearing." Victor Langford leaned forward. "Are you suggesting those companies are connected to this case?" "I am not suggesting," Grace answered calmly. "I am showing that they deserve to be examined." She placed a timeline on the evidence screen. Dates, company names, and transaction records appeared in careful order. Every time Mr. Brooks refused to sell his company through questionable agreements, another organization quietly appeared to purchase strategic assets around him. At first, the pattern looked like coincidence. It was not. The gallery became noticeably more attentive. Reporters who had been preparing stories about Ethan's downfall suddenly began rewriting their notes. Grace continued without raising her voice. The transactions themselves were legal on the surface. That is why they escaped attention for years. But when viewed together, they reveal a coordinated effort to isolate Mr. Brooks's company financially while creating the appearance that his own business decisions caused the damage. Richard immediately stood. Speculation. Grace reached into her briefcase once more. No, sir. She handed another certified file to the court clerk. These are authenticated corporate communications obtained through lawful discovery in a separate civil matter that concluded last year. The names were previously sealed, but the court has now authorized their release. Judge Hayes accepted the documents and quietly read several highlighted passages. Her expression became increasingly serious. Ethan looked toward Grace with surprise. He had known she was building a successful legal career, but he had never imagined she had spent years uncovering pieces of a puzzle connected to his own life. Grace finally looked at him. "You taught me that truth deserves patience," she said softly. "I believed you then, and I believe you now." Ethan's eyes filled with quiet emotion, but he simply nodded. Across the room, Victor carefully reviewed the newly submitted exhibits. The confidence that had defined his opening arguments began to fade. He looked toward Richard, searching for an explanation that never came. Richard avoided his gaze entirely. Judge Hayes placed the final document on the bench and folded her hands. These materials raised significant questions regarding the origin of the allegations before this court. A low murmur spread through the gallery before fading again. Grace then removed one final item from her briefcase, a small digital storage drive sealed inside an evidence bag. She placed it gently beside the documents. "Your Honor," she said, "the records explain the pattern, but what is stored on this drive explains the intent, and once this court sees it, the entire case will be viewed through a completely different light." Judge Eleanor Hayes examined the sealed evidence bag before handing it to the court clerk. Every eye in. The courtroom followed the small device as though it carried the weight of the entire trial. "The court will review the contents," she said. The clerk connected the drive to the courtroom display system, and a list of archived files appeared on the screen. Each file carried a date, a company reference, and a digital certification showing it had not been altered. Grace Carter stepped forward. "Your Honor, these files were preserved through lawful discovery and independently verified before they were released." Richard Holloway rose quickly. "We object until authenticity has been fully established." Judge Hayes nodded. "That is exactly what this court is about to determine." A forensic technology specialist entered the witness stand and confirmed that the files had passed every standard verification procedure. "There is no indication that these records have been modified," the specialist testified. The courtroom fell silent once again. Grace selected the first recording. A business meeting from years earlier appeared on the screen. Faces were blurred under court privacy rules, but the voices were clear. One executive said, "If Brooks refuses the offer, pressure the company from the outside. He values his reputation more than his balance sheet." Another voice answered, "Eventually the public will believe whatever survives the headlines." The recording ended after only a few moments, yet the effect was immediate. Reporters stopped typing and simply stared at the screen. Victor Langford slowly removed his glasses and looked toward Richard. "Did you know about this?" he whispered. Richard did not answer. Grace opened another certified document. This memorandum outlines a strategy to create financial pressure without violating the law directly. It does not accuse Mr. Brooks of wrongdoing. Instead, it describes how public perception could be influenced before any facts were established. Judge Hayes carefully compared the memorandum with the earlier timeline already admitted into evidence. The dates aligned perfectly. Ethan Brooks remained seated, saying nothing. His attorney leaned closer. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" Ethan answered quietly, "Because I did not know she had found it." Grace looked toward Ethan with a gentle smile. "You once told me that truth has a way of finding daylight, even if it takes years." Ethan's expression softened. He remembered saying those words to a frightened teenager after she had lost confidence in herself before an important school debate. He had never imagined she would carry that lesson into a courtroom where his own future depended on it. Judge Hayes turned another page before looking directly at Richard Holloway. The court has now received evidence suggesting that the circumstances surrounding these allegations may be substantially more complex than originally presented. Richard finally stood. His voice remained controlled, but the confidence from earlier had vanished. Your Honor, isolated documents do not prove intent. Grace calmly reached into her briefcase one final time and removed a certified transcript bearing multiple official signatures. She placed it beside the remaining exhibits and said, "You are correct. Documents alone do not prove intent. That is why the next witness will." The courtroom doors opened once more, and an older man in a modest gray suit walked inside with measured steps. No one recognized him except Grace Carter. He carried no dramatic expression, only the quiet look of someone who had finally decided that the truth mattered more than his own comfort. Judge Eleanor Hayes looked toward the witness. "Please state your name for the record." "My name is Daniel Mercer," he answered. "I served as an internal compliance director for one of the investment firms connected to the transactions presented today." Richard Holloway's face tightened. Victor Langford slowly turned toward him. "You never mentioned Mr. Mercer," he whispered. Richard remained silent. Daniel took the oath and settled into the witness chair. Grace approached with calm confidence. "Mr. Mercer, how long did you work in corporate compliance?" "Almost 20 years. During that time, were you responsible for reviewing acquisition strategies and internal communications?" "Yes." Grace handed him the certified transcript. "Do you recognize this document?" Daniel adjusted his glasses. Before reading the first page, "I do. It is a transcript from an internal ethics meeting that I attended several years ago." Grace nodded. "Was Mr. Ethan Brooks ever accused inside that meeting of committing fraud or violating corporate policy?" "No," Daniel answered without hesitation. A quiet murmur spread across the gallery. Grace continued. "Then why was his company repeatedly discussed?" Daniel paused for only a moment. "Because his refusal to participate in questionable business arrangements made him difficult to pressure. Some executives believed that damaging public confidence would eventually force him into negotiations." Richard stood immediately. "Objection. That statement reflects opinion." Judge Hayes looked toward the witness. "Did you personally hear those discussions?" "Yes, Your Honor. I documented several of them because compliance required accurate records." Grace displayed another certified exhibit on the courtroom screen. "Is this one of your reports?" "Yes." "Did you prepare it on the same day as the ethics meeting?" "Yes." Judge Hayes carefully compared the dates. They matched every document already admitted into evidence. Ethan Brooks quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. He was not relieved because his reputation was returning. He was moved because someone had finally spoken honestly after years of silence. Grace noticed him and remembered another moment from long ago. She had been 16 when she lost an important academic competition after another student falsely claimed she had received unfair help. She had come home in tears, convinced that honesty had failed her. Ethan had placed a warm mug of hot chocolate on the kitchen table and said, "Truth does not always arrive first. Sometimes it arrives last, but when it does, it usually stays." Grace had never forgotten those words. She turned back to Daniel. "Mr. Mercer, why have you chosen to testify today after remaining silent for so many years?" Daniel looked directly at Ethan before answering. "Because I watched a decent man carry the weight of suspicion while people like me convinced ourselves that someone else would eventually speak. I realized that waiting was another form of silence." Even Victor Langford lowered his eyes. Judge Hayes folded her hands thoughtfully. "Mr. Mercer, does your testimony end here?" Daniel slowly reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed notebook with handwritten entries. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. "This is the journal I kept during those meetings, and there is one conversation recorded inside that changes everything." Daniel Mercer carefully placed the worn notebook on the witness stand as though it carried more than ink and paper. Judge Eleanor Hayes accepted it and slowly turned the first few pages before stopping at a dated entry. "Mr. Mercer," she asked, "did you write these notes on the day the meeting occurred?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. Every entry was written immediately after each compliance session because accuracy was part of my responsibility. Grace Carter stepped closer. "Did anyone instruct you to create these records?" "No. They were my personal professional notes, kept in case questions ever arose." Grace nodded. "Please read the highlighted passage." Daniel took a slow breath. The discussion focused on Mr. Brooks. One executive stated that his reputation was his greatest asset. Another responded that if the public questioned his integrity, business partners would begin leaving on their own, even without proof of wrongdoing. The courtroom remained completely silent. Reporters looked up from their laptops, unwilling to miss a single word. Ethan Brooks lowered his head for a moment. For years he had wondered why trusted partners had quietly walked away without asking him a single question. Grace spoke again. Was there ever a discussion about fabricating evidence against Mr. Brooks? No, Daniel answered honestly. The strategy was never to invent crimes. The strategy was to create enough doubt that people would stop believing him before the facts could catch up. Judge Hayes looked thoughtfully at the notebook before comparing it with the certified documents already admitted into evidence. Every timeline matched. Every meeting date aligned. Victor Langford slowly rose from his chair. His voice was respectful, but noticeably different from the confidence he had shown earlier. Mr. Mercer, are you testifying under oath that these entries accurately reflect what you personally witnessed? I am. Victor paused for several seconds before quietly sitting back down. Richard Holloway watched the exchange without speaking. His confident posture had disappeared, replaced by the realization that the courtroom was no longer following the story he had expected. Grace walked toward Ethan and placed the faded photograph beside the notebook. Your Honor, she said, this photograph and these records tell the same story in different ways. One shows the kind of man Mr. Brooks chose to be when no one was watching. The other shows what happened when powerful people underestimated the strength of that character. Ethan looked at the photograph and smiled softly. I never imagined you kept it all these years, he said. Grace smiled back. It reminded me that one act of kindness can outlive every false accusation. Even several members of the gallery quietly wiped away tears. Judge Hayes closed the notebook and folded her hands. The evidence presented today raises serious concerns regarding the credibility of the claims originally brought before this court. Before anyone could respond, the court clerk hurried toward the bench carrying a newly delivered envelope marked with the seal of the state attorney's office. Judge Hayes opened it, read the first page, and her expression changed immediately. She looked directly at the courtroom and spoke with calm authority. The court has just received newly certified evidence submitted this morning, and based on its contents, these proceedings are about to take an entirely unexpected direction. Judge Eleanor Hayes slowly lowered the newly delivered documents onto the bench, and the entire courtroom waited for her next words. These records have been independently certified by the state attorney's office, she said. They confirm that additional evidence was preserved during a separate investigation and directly supports several of the exhibits presented today. Richard Holloway's face lost what little confidence remained. Victor Langford carefully reviewed the copies handed to him before quietly closing the folder. After several long moments, he stood. Your Honor, he said with measured professionalism. Based upon the evidence now before this court, I can no longer support the allegations as originally presented. The statement echoed through the silent courtroom. Reporters exchanged astonished glances. Investors who had expected to witness Ethan Brooks's downfall instead watched the entire case change before their eyes. Judge Hayes turned toward Ethan. Mr. Brooks, throughout these proceedings you have remained remarkably composed. Is there anything you wish to say before this court concludes today's hearing? Ethan slowly stood. He looked first at Grace Carter, then at Judge Hayes, and finally toward the gallery filled with strangers. I have spent many years believing that character speaks louder than arguments, he said quietly. There were days when I wanted to defend myself publicly, but I also believed that truth should not need anger to survive. I only hoped that one day the facts would be given the same chance as the accusations. No one interrupted him. Even Richard remained silent. Judge Hayes nodded thoughtfully before delivering her ruling. After reviewing the testimony, certified documents, verified records, and corroborating evidence presented before this court, the allegations against Mr. Brooks cannot be sustained. The court recognizes substantial evidence demonstrating that public perception was influenced by actions unrelated to any proven misconduct on the part of Mr. Brooks. A quiet wave of relief moved through the courtroom. Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to breathe after carrying years of determination into this single day. Ethan looked at her with gratitude that words could barely express. You did not have to do this, he said softly. Grace smiled through tears of relief. You taught me that kindness creates responsibilities, not debts. You gave me a home when I had none. Standing beside you today was never an obligation. It was an honor. Ethan gently embraced her, and the courtroom remained respectfully silent. Judge Hayes watched the moment before offering one final observation. The law examines evidence, she said. But today's proceedings also remind us that integrity often reveals itself over time, even when it is questioned in the present. Daniel Mercer quietly left the witness stand with a sense of peace he had not carried for years. Victor Langford approached Ethan and extended his hand. I am sorry for the assumptions that were made before every fact was known. Ethan accepted the handshake without hesitation. Thank you for choosing fairness when it mattered most. As the courtroom slowly emptied, reporters no longer chased scandal. Instead, they spoke about perseverance, honesty, and the extraordinary bond between a father and the daughter whose life he had changed with one compassionate decision years earlier. The faded photograph remained on the evidence table until Grace carefully picked it up and slipped it back into her briefcase. Some people build companies that last for decades. Others build lives that change forever with a single act of quiet kindness. Ethan Brooks had managed to do both, and in the end, it was never wealth that saved his legacy. It was the love he had freely given when no one was watching.